No, I didn't see it. It's the ones that I didn't have to donate how much. I was seeing how much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's Politalk roundtable discussion on the Russia invasion of Ukraine 1 year later. I'm Akuffo, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and also the head of. Before the roundtable discussion, I'm honored to introduce to you acting president of UFV, the Vice Chancellor, Dr. James Mandigo, provide land acknowledgement. Thank you. But I would like to tell you a little bit about Dr. James Mandigo. Dr. James Mandigo is currently the acting president and vice chancellor at the University of the Fraser Valley. Prior to arriving at UFV in September 2019 as provost and vice president academic, Dr. Mandigo spent close to 20 years at Brock University, where he's assumed several roles, including vice provost for enrollment management and international, interim dean, associate dean, and co-director for the Center for Healthy Development. Dr. Mandigo's most recent research and scholarly activity has focused on the role of sports and physical education to foster the development of life skills and the prevention of youth violence in Central American countries of El Salvador and Guatemala. He has also been a visiting scholar at the University of Tsukuba International Academy for Sports in Japan, and provided leadership role with the Scotia Champions for Health Promoting Schools in the Caribbean islands of St. Vincent, Antigua, and British Virgin Islands. Now, one fun fact that I learned today about Dr. Mandigo is that he really likes April Fool's Day. When he pulls up, little, fun, tricks with the family and friends. In fact, I'm kind of, wondering what he's going to do this coming Saturday, which happens to be, April 1st and April Fool's Day. One thing that we all can be sure is that it's a Saturday, so we'll not be on campus, so we don't get to be pulled, pulled on us. Dr. Mandigo, please, podium is all yours, and your audience are ready to hear from you. Please help me to welcome Dr. Mandigo.
Thank you, Dr. Akuffo, for that warm introduction and warning to the campus community about April 1st. Swell, James Mandigo, Teltsquee. My name is James Mandigo, acting president and vice chancellor of UFB. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Politalk event. The University of the Fraser Valley is situated on Stalo-Tamuk, the territory of the Stalo, the people of the river, whose native language is Halkamelam. Stalo have been the stewards of this magnificent land since time immemorial. I'd like to pay special recognition to our closest neighbors to where we're located here today, the Matsqui, Sumac, and Kwantlen First Nations. UFV is committed to recognizing and honoring the contribution that Aboriginal people have made and continue to make in our communities. I'd like to acknowledge the work and collaboration that's gone into the Politalk Lecture and Roundtable series since its inception in October 2016. Tackling topics from the recent Fraser Valley flood to the struggles for Palestinian rights at the United Nations, to gender parity and global peace. These events continue to be enriching opportunities for us to engage on issues of interest that contribute to achieving our mission of engaging learners, transforming lives, and building communities. I'm so proud to see so many people coming together at UFB across disciplines and research backgrounds to spark dialogue and change, and for enabling each of us to engage in UFB's aspiration of Yakatu. be a house of transformation locally and beyond. Today, UFV faculty will share their insight on the first year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We will learn about how the war has impacted the people of Ukraine and how also exacerbated the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, supply chain crunches, high food and energy prices, and deepening of great power rivalries. In today's world, we are experiencing more change, more disruption, and more upheaval than has been experienced in most of our lifetimes. Political and cultural conflict, growing inequality, climate change, and rapid decrease in the health of our planet and those living across the globe, and an unprecedented reliance on technologies are contributing to an environment of significant uncertainty. I believe it's the role of a university, a place of higher learning, to provide opportunities to listen and to learn so that we can consider ways in which we can contribute to positive and necessary change. I'd like to thank Dr. Akuffo for your leadership on the Politalk series with Dr. Telford, Dr. Sheffield, Larissa Horn, Dr. Curtin, and Dr. Hubel for sharing with us this afternoon and giving us opportunity to connect and learn together. And of course, thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoy this afternoon's event. Unfortunately, I need to leave about 4:30, so I'm going to sit in the back and enjoy the first half of the presentation, but I'll speak out quietly. But I really am looking forward to today's talk, and thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Mandigo, for the land acknowledgement and also activating our curiosity about what promises to be very thought-provoking, rich, and insightful discussion this afternoon. Before we move on, I would like to say that the Politalk Roundtable series and lectures is a platform engaging in topical issues, pushing the boundaries of ideas and knowledge claims, creating public awareness, and sustaining active minds that are conscious of political, cultural, and socioeconomic issues and transformations in our community and the world at large. Please follow us on Instagram at UFV Post, POSC, UFV POSC. May I now introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon, Dr. Hamish Telford. Dr. Hamish Telford is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. Professor Telford's teaching and research focuses on Canadian politics. He is the author of Engaging Canadian Politics, Northroads 2021, and Talking Past Each Other, Quebec and the Federal Dialogue in Canada, 1867 to 2017, Interlang 2018. He is a past president of BC Political Studies Association and twice served on the board of the Canadian Political Science Association. He's a frequent commentator on BC and Canadian politics in the national and international media. You can be sure to watch television for the next few days because he's likely to appear there to talk about the budget. It's going to happen at some point. Dr. Telford, please, let's welcome.
Very much. So my job here today is to keep time. Not always easy with academics or used to speaking in 3-hour blocks, but I will do my best to keep them to 10 minutes. We have 5 speakers. I think I will introduce them in order of presentation. I'll do that now rather than keep jumping back up here. Our first speaker today will be Professor Akuffo, who's an associate professor of international relations and chair of the Department of Political Science here at the University of the Fraser Valley. He is the immediate past president of the International Study Association's Canada branch and a member of the University of Waterloo-based Defence and Security Foresight Group. Edwards' research focuses on Canada's foreign policy and security policy in Africa, African Union-NATO interregional security cooperation, and maritime security in Africa. And he has published widely on these topics in a variety of outlets. Our next speaker will be Dr. Scott Sheffield, who is an associate professor of history at the University of the Fraser Valley. His research examines Indigenous experiences in the Second World War, as well as the impact of the war on British Columbia. He's the author of 2 academic monographs, books, and several book chapters and articles, including Canadian First Nations and the British Connection during the Second World War. Then we're going, Dr. Sebastian Hubel is a limited term appointee in the Department of History at the University of theme here about historians on this panel. I thought this was a Politalk. I suppose we stand to learn. Dr. Hubel's research looks at modern Germany and Europe, as well as German and Jewish history. He's the author of Fighter, Worker, and Family Man, German Jewish Men and Their Gendered Experiences in Nazi Germany from 1933 to 1941, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2021. Dr. Mark Kirsten is an assistant professor of criminology at the University of the Fraser Valley. His research and teaching at UFE focuses on international and Canadian law, as well as justice for human rights and political violence. In addition to his academic duties, Mark is a senior consultant with the Wayamo Foundation, did I pronounce that correctly? And founder of the blog Justice in Conflict. He's the author of Justice in Conflict, the effects of the International Criminal Court's interventions on ending wars and building peace, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. And our last speaker will be Larissa Horn, who is the Experiential Educational Coordinator here at the University of the Fraser Valley, a sessional instructor in the Department of History at the University of the Fraser Valley. Larissa specializes in Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet studies with an emphasis on political and cultural history. Her additional areas of teaching include geopolitics in the Cold War era, post-communist Eurasia, and the subjects of global security and secret intelligence. So I think we have a very esteemed panel here who will provide us a lot of insight on this first anniversary of the conflict in Ukraine. So, Professor Akuffo, you're up first. I'll get my watch out.
Thank you so very much, everyone, once again, for coming. I think before I offer my comments, I think it's important, and I think it's in order to say that war is a very nasty thing, and people, die. It is a nasty thing that individuals who are not, anywhere close to power, die. Innocent civilians, as well as soldiers who willingly offer themselves to go to war, and those who even unwillingly want to go to war. And it is important to acknowledge this fact, and to say that for those who have departed, I think you will all agree with me that may their souls rest in peace. We all look for peace, and I think it's important that we pursue peace at all times. Having said that, I would like to say that my comments really are going to focus on, as an academic, to do an academic, job. What academics, do is look at, facts and analyze them. And I'm going to try to do that to the best of my, ability. But I'm also, conscious of the fact that I'm also human. So I have to reflect on what I say. And in that basis, it's not going to be all scientific, that it's going to be somehow, normative, as well. What that means is that I'll be sharing ideas, both from a scientific or social scientific perspective, but also from the normative, side, where I place myself in that kind of, conversation. Now, having said that, the war in Ukraine, what has changed since 24th of February, 2022? I think not much has changed, and that what we see rather is the continuity of the struggle for power and domination. Now, the Russia war in Ukraine, in many ways, has been framed as a resistance to Russia's anti-democratic culture, or the violation of international law and norms of sovereignty and non-intervention in the internal affairs of states. Now, these framings I will argue, are products of the Westphalian international system that see states as atomistic individuals that are wired with material interests, which pursuit, for most of the time, is without due regard for morality and human rights. In fact, most world history, both in the distant past and in the near future, is replete with such behaviors of states. Although states' pursuit of their material interests has not always taken violent turns, the 1998 Ethiopia-Eritrea War and the 2003 United States invasion of Iraq are stark reminders, just as the current case of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, that governments usually do not hesitate to use violence when they perceive an existential threat to their core national interests. Indeed, great powers, such as the United States, Russia, are more prone to violent behavior than middle powers like Canada and other small powers like the country where I was born, Ghana. Since great powers, as the realist school of international politics, argue, hate peer competitors. The great powers, hate peer competitors. From a normative or a moralistic standpoint, the Russia invasion of Ukraine portrays a world that is in need of positive change from the bondage of the Westphalian international system, a world where human rights will be protected as sacrosanct, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or gender, where states settle highly contentious issues peacefully and diplomatically, and negotiate where negotiation rules supreme, where the very structure of global governance, world order, will promote inclusivity and diversity. In short, moralists will argue for the need to transition to a world where interstate democracy and norms of human rights protection are deeply entrenched in the domestic governance of states. Now, nevertheless, I wish to submit that these ideas are more like wishful thinking. It does not come close to the reality of international politics as far as the Russia war in Ukraine is concerned. The naked pursuit of material power rules supreme, whether we look at the war from the perspective of Russia, who started the war, or Ukraine, who have the right of self-defense as contained in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, or Western powers, including the European Union and NATO members like Canada, who are providing material, diplomatic, and political support to Ukraine. Indeed, the Westphalian international order and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has provided new justifications for increased defense spending, contrary to the hope of cutting such spending in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War and in the 1990s. In fact, for those of us who are not aware, Canada, for example, cut its defense spending in the 1990s and withdraw, Canadian troops, from Europe after the ending of the Cold War. Yet what we see is Germany, which for a very long time has not increased defense spending, is now is hiking its defense spending by 10 billion euros in 2024. On December 23rd, 2022, the Japanese cabinet unveiled its 2023 budget for the Japanese defense forces, totaling 6.8 trillion yen, which translates or exchange into about $52 billion. Now, the new budget is 26% higher than the Japanese defense force budget of 2022. Now, last spring, Canada also announced that it is going to invest 38.6 billion over the next 20 years to modernize the North America Aero Defense Command, and spending another 7.6 billion, to buy new, fighter jets. Now, on the continent, of Africa, the war is portraying a remaking of the Cold War rivalries and the likely intensification of violent conflict and decline of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. But the Washington-based National Democratic, Institute has rightly, argued that for Russia, Africa provides opportunities to limit the effects of sanctions, those economic sanctions that have been placed on Russia, project global power, and undermine the liberal international order, an order that is marked with free market, ideas and the promotion of the rule of law and democracy. Now, for example, if you look at the BRIC, or the BRIC countries, which are the emerging economies, it has provided a platform and also a cover for the deepening of South Africa, China, and Russia strategic relations in opposition to what we may call Western hegemonic influence on the African continent. Now, this is exemplified by South African naval exercise with Russia and China in about a month ago. Actually, that exercise took place on the 17th of February. So, in conclusion, what has really changed since February 24, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine? It is not so much of a change, but rather, as I said, we rather see continuity of the struggle for power and domination. And it appears that we are somehow caught up in a cycle of perpetual violence, of greater proportions that are promoted by or are led by great powers of our time. I think I will end here and I will let others in. Thank you very much.
Crazy. The historian, we don't do short. Anyway, a year ago, we had the Politalk a month after the outbreak of the Ukraine war. When we spoke at that time, Russian forces were still battling. Still battling in the northern suburbs of Kyiv, pressing on Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, north. They've taken Kherson, driving west on Mykolaiv towards Odessa in the south, and surrounded, and we're beginning to pummel Mariupol in the submission in the southeast. A lot has changed in 12 months of the battlefield. The momentum and the military initiative has shifted back and forth between the two sides. First, against all the odds, and frankly, most of the pundits' predictions, I think myself included, Ukraine held the initial Russian multi-pronged strikes everywhere, inflicting crippling losses in both men and materiel. And Russia ultimately opted to withdraw its forces from the north and northeast in order to concentrate on trying to retake the entirety of the Donbass region in the east of the country. And sustained its efforts also subsequently to consolidate in the south. In the spring and into early summer, Russia held the initiative still, gradually grinding its way to capturing all of Luhansk and the larger portions of Donetsk and Kherson Oblast, but only through massive expenditure of artillery, ammunition, and continuing heavy casualties. By late July, it was clear its offensives were beginning to run out of steam. And thus, in September, after telegraphing a counterattack in the south to drive Russians back across the Dnipro River near Kherson, which would draw substantial numbers of Russian reinforcements into an untenable position on the wrong side of the river, Ukrainian forces actually managed to catch the Russians by surprise, counterattacking instead east of Kharkiv in the northeast, catching the Russians thin on the ground there, breaking through their lines and forcing them into full-scale retreat. Kharkiv was largely liberated, and the Russians were driven back into Luhansk, in what was a really stunning reversal of fortune. This was followed by continued heavy pressure on the Russian defenders in and around Kherson in the south, who were hopelessly positioned on the west of the Dnieper River with inadequate supplies, and ultimately the Russian Federation opted to withdraw them back across the river, and thereby abandoning the only provincial capital that Russian forces had managed to take. This dramatic series of defeats would force Putin's hand, and he would initiate a limited mobilization of roughly 300,000 Russian men to restock his depleted and exhausted forces, tempting the support of the domestic population in Russia, which held, if only barely, for his special military operation. To the latter part of 2022 and early 2023, therefore, the front lines achieved a degree of stasis on both sides as they gathered their strength for what would be renewed offensives in the new year. Through the winter, Russia has also expanded a campaign, strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure, intended to intensify the pressure on the Ukrainian civilian population and government. But while this caused a great deal of damage and discomfort and suffering for the Ukrainian people, it has ultimately proved futile at destroying their will to resist. Now, in terms of the current winter Russian offensive, since late January, the Russian army has hurriedly begun to shift its newly mobilized, but largely inadequately trained and equipped forces back into renewed offensive operations. It's enabled them to regain the initiative, particularly in Donbass, where much of the pressure has been focused, in and around the city of Bakhmut, which has little obvious strategic value, but has come to hold major symbolic value for the Russians who are hungry for any victory, and also for the Ukrainians for whom Bakhmut has become a symbol of their dogged resistance. Other attacks, though, have also been launched towards Volodar, Matveyivka, Western Donetsk, and along the Svatov, Kremina, Kupiansk line in Luhansk in the east. Russian forces have been trying to adapt from their failed efforts of the last year, which were largely built around highly mechanized force units known as battalion tactical groups, which were designed for maneuver warfare of the type that was envisioned in their early multi-pronged strikes. These fuel-intensive ad hoc formations, however, didn't do the job and struggled in large part due to their heavy logistical demands, which the Russian military supply system has proved utterly unable to sustain. Russian tank losses as well have been excessively heavy, estimated to now exceed 1,500, more than half their initial tank strength nationwide. And thousands more armored vehicles of other types have also been lost. The material losses are irrecoverable for the Russian forces at this stage. Indeed, recent reports suggest that the Russian military is starting to dig T-54 and T-55 tanks out of deep storage to make good some of their tank losses in Ukraine. These, by the way, were phased out by the Soviets starting in 1980. So they were obsolete in 1980, massively obsolete now. Russian forces and leadership have consistently struggled to adapt and revamp their approach to fighting in order to find success in the battlefield. Mostly this has involved chopping and changing senior officers at both battlefield and theater commands, as well as in higher governmental ministry command. None of which has produced any benefits because of the startling degree to which these problems the Russian military are dealing with are in fact systemic and structural within the culture and the organization of the system itself. One recent adaptation has seen a shift to what are called assault detachments in the Russian forces. These are infantry-centric, slightly smaller formations, using quite simplified tactics for what are essentially frontal and urban fighting, such as we've seen in and around Soledar and Bakhmut. They're heavily dependent on artillery support to shoot them onto target. And though they have some armored elements in these formations, some observers have noted that often Russian tanks are providing direct fire support from the rear. They're not actually pulling forward with the infantry because of the high vulnerability they have to Ukrainian anti-tank weapons. These have been augmented by Wagner mercenary group forces, reinforced with convict personnel who are used in costly human wave attacks, which, though successful, have been massively massively heavy in casualties. Western intelligence reports suggest total Russian casualties now exceed 200,000, with deaths amongst those pushing 50,000. And Russian industry is heavily struggling in its efforts to ramp up production in the face of Western sanctions, its own inefficiencies, and endemic corruption. And we can see this in the declining fire rates from Russian artillery. In the early days of the war, Russian artillery were averaging around 60,000 shells fired per day. They're now, in February of this year, down to around 20,000 a day. Though Russian forces continue to attack in Donbass, and clearly it's clear, I think, that their power and momentum is waning. All those 300,000 personnel are now largely ground up, and there are no new additional forces to throw in that can largely enhance or speed up their momentum. Which brings us to the impending Ukraine spring offensives. Much talked about. Like Russia, the Ukraine military has spent the last few months trying to reconstitute and build new combat-capable forces. To that end, they have not only sustained as little forces they can manage on the front while still holding and grinding up the Russian attacks this year, but they've also been training new forces in preparation for the spring. The one exception is Bakhmut, where in recent weeks, additional experienced Ukrainian forces have been plugged in an effort to hold the city, despite Western forecasts that perhaps a strategic retreat was in order. Partly this is because I think it has become symbolically important to Ukraine. And partly because I think that for the Ukrainian military, as one official said, Bakhmut is a good place to kill Russians. Given the massive losses Russia's suffering, force ratios between the Russian ground forces and the Ukrainian ground forces are starting to come back into relative balance. Away from the front lines, Ukraine's busy training new personnel, a lot of it in NATO countries, Poland, Germany, UK, etc. Sometimes facilitated by NATO training personnel and to Western tactical doctrines and standards. A lot of this is also necessary because, of course, the Western nations have been finally prevailed upon to provide Western military equipment in the form of Leopard 2 tanks, Challenger 2 tanks from Britain, and apparently eventually American M1 Abrams. To these have been added many hundreds of other infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and support vehicles. All of these vehicle packages are needed to enable the Ukrainians to produce effective combined arms operations, which the NATO training should help to enhance. However, the relatively small number of tanks that the West has provided, maybe less than 100, though they will provide significant bite to the Ukrainian spring counteroffensives, are not a magic bullet. They will be destroyed and damaged in operations, and the West is not likely ready or able to continue to supply them in large numbers. In that sense, I think we need to measure our expectations in advance of Ukrainian operations, which we'll see launched in the coming weeks. I'm cautiously optimistic that the Ukrainians might be able to create some breakthroughs in Russian defenses, such as we saw in Kharkiv last September. If this happens, we may again see a Russian military morale collapse, such as we saw last fall, and sections of the Russian front could theoretically collapse. If so, there is a prospect, I think, that Russian forces could be driven out of at least sections of occupied Ukraine for the summer. However, the Russians have also spent the last 4 to 6 months preparing successive layers of defensive lines, fortifications, and minefields in anticipation of these Ukrainian counterattacks. And it is always easier to defend than it is to conduct offensive operations. So we should not take Russian military incompetence in offensive operations as a certain guarantee that they will suck at defending as well. And Ukrainian forces will not be able to win easy victories, even if they come. They will come at heavy cost. Putin seems to be banking on Russia being able to out-suffer Ukraine. If the Ukrainian counterattacks go poorly this spring, we may well see that strategy gaining some momentum. There's more, but I've burned through my time and I want to leave my colleagues a little, including the question of, is there a military solution to all of this? Perhaps we can engage that in the Q&A at the end.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you to the organizers for running this very important event, and thank you for having me, of course, and Great presentations so far, and I'm sure there's going to be more stimulating, interesting talks to come. Also, very pleased to see so many students here. I mean, that's why we're doing this, right? It's not for faculty and staff, it's for the students, of course. Anyways, thank you again. And I would like to focus my presentation on Europe. It's my personal background, born and raised in Germany. I specialize in European history, especially Germany. And I would like to offer a few observations and interpretations based on what happened in Europe within the last 12 months or so, based on the war that had started in the Ukraine. My main argument basically can be summed up in the following way. I think it's safe to say that the Russian government in this ongoing conflict can be broken into several objectives. And I would like to focus today on two objectives that Russia has staged and that relate and pertain to Europe. The first argument I would like to make was a two-pronged approach, so to speak. The first objective I'd like to focus on is how Russia tried to exert military control over the Ukraine and thereby establish political hegemony over the area and stop the latter, that is the Ukraine, from taking a more West-oriented pro-European Union stance, so to speak. In this regard, Russia has failed. Europe and the Ukraine have never stood closer to one another. That's my first argument. And the second one, very related, Russia arguably has also tried to drive a wedge between the Europeans to spread disunity and strife. And here too, I would argue Russia has failed. The European Union thus far has stood the test of unity. And now to prove or demonstrate my argument, I would like to give you 3 or 4 brief examples. Then again, we can talk more about it in the Q&A. Example number 1. So first of all, I think the support for the Ukraine, globally speaking, has been enormous. And so it was in Europe as well. If you look at these photos here of demonstrations, peace demonstration, and so on, you can see in the background image, this is the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. If you zoom out of this photo, we see these kinds of pictures. And I think many European cities have witnessed this over the last 12 months. So my first point to underline how Russia has failed in its objectives in regards to the European Union is number 1, Ukrainian refugees. I think it's noteworthy to mention that the war in the Ukraine has not been concomitant to a refugee crisis. And some call it this way, but I don't think it's an appropriate term. Yes, it's true there has been critics hoping to stop the influx of Ukrainian refugees coming into Western and Central Europe, but they have been relatively silent and a minority. The acceptance of European societies to welcome refugees' families, and that is often women, children, while the men, of course, stay in Ukraine to fight, was evidenced through the provision of shelter, forms of employment, offering language courses, and other kinds of retraining programs to integrate Ukrainians in various European countries. It's often been quite heartwarming, to be honest. And this is often also something that is absent in the media, how Ukrainian refugees have been accepted in European countries over the past 2 months. My point is, and this is especially interesting, in Eastern Europe, there have been no waves of protest against these immigrants. And this was not the case if we go back in 2016, 17, 18, when there was a refugee crisis, when refugees came from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Northern Central Africa, and so on. So there is a shift happening here, except for the political right and the political left that want to, especially the political right, of course, that is, warning the influx of refugees can change, the dominant culture in these nation states, so to speak. Opposition has been relatively silent. My main point is this: it is safe to say, I think, that Putin might have anticipated some similar kind of controversies within Europe in regards to the refugee issue. But this has not happened. We have 4+ million Ukrainians who have been refugees that migrated to Europe, and this crisis, and the term crisis is inappropriate to use, so to speak. They have been relatively warmly accepted, and it is, we have to remind ourselves here as a historian, it has been the largest refugee movement since the Second World War. So we're looking at enormous numbers here. For once, Europe showed unequivocal solidarity at the political level, and also it's important to say at the grassroots level. Many ordinary folks invested countless of hours welcoming Ukrainian families, providing shelter, and giving other kinds of support. That's point number 1. Point number 2, related to this humanitarian aid, is the energy crisis. And again, in a sense, this is also an economic weapon, right? I mean, if you accept 4+ million refugees, that is costly and someone has to pay the bill, so to speak. But again, it did not cause that kind of disunity. When it comes to the gas and energy crisis, this was almost more dramatic in the news over the last 12 months. And I followed that very closely in the German case, so to speak. Safe to say, and probably unsurprising, there was an energy crisis when Putin stopped delivering gas, natural gas in particular, to Central and Western Europe. Sorry, Eastern Europe. It was especially the East European and Central European countries, Germany, Poland, that have been overly reliant on gas imports. So these countries were hit the hardest. And in preparation for today, and I'm not a math wizard, but I did do a little bit of math. I calculated and I looked at my own gas bill for this BC. And believe it or not, I pay around 100 to 120 bucks a month on natural gas. Now that comes down to 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. I know it sounds scientific, I'm almost done here. If you look at the graph, however, we can see to what prices natural gas has jumped in Germany not too long ago, last year basically, over 18 cents. Now that is factor 4. So imagine what it meant, what would it mean for us to spend $400, $500, $600 a month on natural gas? And that does not even include electricity. Point is, here too, we could see possible disunity and a kind of strife that Putin probably would have appreciated, so to speak. Country going against country, so to speak, trying to figure out where we can import gas, natural gas from Qatar to Canada, everyone against everyone, we're all on our own, so to speak. And it's true, there has been no transparent, coordinated plan by the European Union to purchase gas and to kind of distribute it equally and equitably, so to speak. It's true, the European Union is a monster and it often gets bogged down in details. But my point here is, no Europeans had to go cold. They didn't freeze over the last winter. It was anticipated there was a crisis or a perception of a crisis, but it did not materialize. Why? For once, price caps were introduced. So the governments took an active approach to make sure these prices would not go through the roof even more so. And especially low-income and mid-income households were financially supported through subsidies and so on. On a side note, so anyways, again, the point here is, again, this kind of disunity, strife, discontent, and possible opposition to the way the European Union took its approach towards the war did not materialize. On a side note, the exit from Russian gas was not only unprecedented, it happened within a record time. Countries dependent on Russian gas no longer are. And another side note I have to make, we also see a renewal in initiatives to invest in renewable energies. Almost ironic, so to speak, that it's not the UN summits on global warming, but it is the Ukrainian war that sees now again this kind of initiative in renewable energies. Point number 3 is military aid. Countries, as was mentioned before, Canada, the United States, but also Germany, the UK, France, and the countries in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, or Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, they have been the main donors, so to speak, when it comes to military aid. Often there have been lengthy, stretched out, and also emotional discussions. Should we do it? Should we not? How can we help the Ukraine? From helmets to sending ammunition to tanks, German, what are they called? Panther tanks. Or was it the Tigers, the Panthers? I think it was, what? Leopards, exactly, Leopards, there we go. And now also we're talking about jet airplanes, right? I mean, Slovakia and other countries are thinking about sending their jets, so to speak. Here too, we see kind of a unanimous support towards helping the Ukraine militarily. And here too, I would argue Putin did not foresee this. He probably saw, some kind of lukewarm words of support, helping the Ukraine through humanitarian aid, maybe a few other kinds of symbolic gestures, but not this kind of military aid. Is it enough? I don't know. We have military experts here like Scott, but I would argue this has been significant, it has been lasting, and it has been effective, at least to this day. I cannot, again, say how much it will have an effect in the future, but again, except for the far left and the far right that want to negotiate with Russia, Europe has been relatively steadfast in supporting the Ukraine once again, militarily. This is a good thing or not so good thing. We are witnessing another arms race here. I think is something we could talk about in the Q&A here. But again, I think if countries like the Baltic states and the East European states are sending their jet planes and everything else, and thereby make themselves technically vulnerable, that is a very strong message. If you send your own military to another country and help that other country and thereby kind of undress yourself, this is something we have not seen in European history. My final point, here's a statistic and that shows us from Germany over the last few months, how many Germans do support Ukraine militarily. The 47 stands for what we do is the right amount, what we're doing is good. The 31 is more critical and says, no, this is too much. We should not deliver weapons to the Ukraine. The 16, however, which used to be higher, as you can see, says we should do even more. So if you count together 47 and 16, we are 2/3. There's a 2/3 majority throughout time that says we need to support the Ukraine militarily. And again, my final point here is the cultural political shift that has been happening, in my humble opinion, the most important one here. So a lot has changed, in my opinion. The Ukraine has made an enormous leap towards the West. The damage and the terror that Russia has inflicted on Ukrainian society, first of all, will not be forgotten and will not be overcome for generations, I would argue. But at the same time, more Ukrainians desire to be more closely aligned with the European Union and the West in general. We all remember Biden's visit to Kiev a few weeks ago. Now, this is a mindset, a shift in mentality that is highly significant. The Ukraine, as you likely know, wants to join NATO. Now it also wants to join the European Union. And what I find almost more interesting or fascinating is that there seems to be some willingness in the West to make this exactly happen. I don't think there's any doubt this will be a long stretch out process, a bumpy road to take, so to speak, but it is at the same time an organic cultural shift, kind of a shift, in a tectonic shift, so to speak. The European Union or Europe and the Ukraine have never been closer to one another. And I'm speaking of anecdotal evidence. When I still lived in Germany, it's just barely 10, 15 years ago, where the Ukraine had a very different standing, a poor rating, so to speak, a low standing. It was one of these former Soviet countries. There's these oligarchs, these kind of corrupt officials, civil servants, Timoshenko as a dictator in Kiev, close to Putin. The Ukraine did not have a high standing. Look where we are right now. It becomes a possibility that the European Union, it will expand itself, and the Ukraine will actually join the European Union and other Western organizations. The popular images, in conclusion, of the Ukraine have been overhauled, and I would argue irreversibly. This will not change so quickly. While Putin wanted and still wants to incorporate the Ukraine into a Russian sphere of influence, directions point to the opposite. Ukrainians will never again accept imposed rule, but push for national self-determination. The Ukraine and Europe have never stood closer to one another. Thank you very much.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right, thank you and good afternoon. Thank you, Edward, Noah, Natasha, everyone for putting this on. I'm going to talk about accountability efforts, so efforts to address some of the mass atrocities and systemic human rights violations that we've seen in the war in Ukraine. And I'm going to start and also end with the most recent development and what it means, namely the arrest warrant issued for Vladimir Putin and his non-ironically named children's rights officer in his office on war crimes charges relating to the forcible abduction and transfer of Ukrainian children, an estimated 16,000 Ukrainian children, either from their families or from orphanages from Ukraine into either Russian-held territory or Russia itself. So the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for a head of state, Vladimir Putin, and Maria Lvova-Belova, his children's rights commissioner. But that's really just the very tip, and perhaps the most dramatic tip of a larger iceberg of accountability efforts that have been ongoing for a long time. It is not true that this is the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine began in 2014, and it is a very interesting thing that we only have enough of a political memory sometimes to think back to last year and that invasion. We cut out quite a lot. In fact, we cut out the vast majority of the International Criminal Court's investigation, which was initiated in 2014 and found grounds that Russians and Ukrainians had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in eastern parts of the country. But of course, since 2022, our imagination, our interest in Ukraine for a whole series of reasons has dramatically changed. And so has the international community's interest in accountability efforts. And so what we've seen from the International Criminal Court, from the International Court of Justice, and from states like Canada that I'll talk about, is a dramatic increase of interest in trying to address war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the country. We have also seen a resuscitation to some extent of the International Criminal Court and international criminal law. I've been working in that field for almost 15 years now, both practicing and studying. And prior to 2022, people were mostly just talking about how the ICC was biased against African states or how it was impotent to address mass atrocities. And now it seems to be on the tips of everyone's tongues when we talk about accountability efforts in Ukraine. So whilst the ICC has not yet been able to do a great deal for Ukraine, Ukraine has interestingly done a lot to help the reputation and legitimacy of the ICC itself. Now, of course, it is investigating, and there are ongoing investigations into all 4 international crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, which I will come back to, and the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression is a crime that stems from the Nuremberg trials after World War II of Nazis, and it relates to the crime of committing illegal war. It is illegal war criminalized. Think of the invasion of Iraq. That is a very good example of a criminal war, not just an illegal war, but a crime. The crime of aggression did not exist at that time. It does exist now, and the ICC technically has jurisdiction over it. However, Canada, the United States, France, and a number of other states ensured that when the Rome Statute, which underpins the International Criminal Court, got jurisdiction over illegal war and the crime of aggression, the jurisdiction was so narrow and so limited that it would never apply to a situation like Russia invading another country like Ukraine. This is a stain, I think, on Canada's relationship with the International Criminal Court, and the fact that it neutered and undermined the ability of international bodies like the ICC to investigate and prosecute illegal war. So the crime of aggression cannot be prosecuted in Ukraine. The invasion cannot be prosecuted unless a brand new international tribunal is created and set up and staffed. Outside of the International Criminal Court, however, it's really perhaps the most important thing that is happening with respect to accountability efforts in Ukraine is in Ukraine. It doesn't get nearly as much media attention, but there are ongoing trials of Russian officers and soldiers in Ukrainian courts. That's really significant. I don't know how many people have had an opportunity to actually go to Ukraine. I went in 2019 and spent some time working with lawyers and speaking about justice and accountability efforts there. And Ukraine is not like Rwanda after the genocide, which had an extremely difficult time. I think the estimates there were that 8 lawyers had remained in the country. The justice system was completely destroyed after the genocide. Ukraine has a functioning judiciary. It has issues, but it has capabilities to do exactly this work, and it is. Not only is it doing it, it's doing it quite well in line with fair trial standards. So, for example, the first person to be prosecuted for war crimes in Ukraine was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Shishmarin, and he was prosecuted and sentenced to life imprisonment. So 50 years, I believe it was, in Ukraine for murdering a civilian. On appeal, his sentence was released to 25 years because he was young, he was remorseful, he apologized to the family, and because in criminological terms, rehabilitation and remorse actually count for something. And that's great. It showed that the Court of Appeal would take into account what it should have taken into account, and that the court system, even in a country that has been invaded and at war, is willing to take the law seriously as opposed to just punish as harshly as it possibly can any Russian soldiers that it gets into detention or into jail. So the justice system there is functioning. And in fact, this is the most important place where justice can happen. Justice is always better served as close as possible to victims and survivors and affected communities. Many Ukrainians that I speak to want their justice system to investigate and prosecute individuals who've committed mass atrocities in their justice system. Why? Because they don't really want to fly to The Hague or to the International Criminal Court or to Geneva. They want to see these individuals put on trial in their communities or at least close by so that they can see with their own eyes what accountability can look like. This brings me to the role of Canada. Canada's had a very significant role since 2022. Aside from the fact that it helped ensure that the International Criminal Court cannot investigate illegal war, the crime of aggression, it has done some positive things. It joined 42 other states in referring, so in asking the International Criminal Court to investigate the situation in Ukraine. A symbolic move, but still also a very important move. It's also given millions of dollars in voluntary donations to the International Criminal Court's prosecutor to deal with crimes, including sexual and gender-based violence crimes, and to focus on the Ukraine situation. That has actually come under some criticism because instead of giving money regularly to all situations, it's only giving money with respect to Ukraine, raising the question of whether Canada and other states giving voluntary contributions to the ICC are trying to push the direction of the court. You may not know this, but Canada has an investigation of its own into the situation in Ukraine. It opened in the summer what they call a structural investigation. Canada has a special program allowing Ukrainian refugees to come into the country. When they do, many of them are interviewed by war crimes investigators who take this evidence, store it, and then share it with international courts and other states who may be able to investigate and prosecute specific perpetrators. That being said, one of the biggest criticisms of accountability efforts in Ukraine are that over the last year, Ukraine has gotten almost all of the attention and all of the money of states when it comes to addressing international crimes. And it is not the only situation where mass atrocities are happening. Ukraine is not the only place where alleged genocide has happened. It is not the only place where war crimes are happening. The people of Palestine also deserve attention when it comes to international crimes. The people of Afghanistan deserve attention when it comes to international crimes. They also deserve better when it comes to bringing them in as refugees after the Taliban's fall. The people of Myanmar deserve accountability for international crimes, but Ukraine has kind of, in some respects, sucked the air out of the room. Now, when I talk to advocates, victims, survivors, people from those other situations, they don't believe that Ukrainians deserve any less. They just want the type of attention that Ukrainians want. They want the situation in Ukraine and the response with respect to accountability to be what they get as a response to accountability. They don't want Ukrainians to have less. They want Ukraine to set a precedent so that states like Canada give millions of dollars so that people in the other countries that I mentioned also receive justice and accountability. And of course, closer to home, Indigenous communities who have faced the brunt of international crimes also deserve justice. And the Ukrainian situation may actually help them get a degree of it. How? I mentioned at the outset that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin because he's ordered the abduction and forcible transfer of children from Ukraine into Russia. That can also constitute an act of genocide under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and under the 1948 Genocide Convention. It is many people's hope, and in fact, insiders anticipate that the International Criminal Court's investigators will build a case of genocide against Vladimir Putin. If they do, we will for the first time have a significant moment and amount of evidence and details on how you can investigate the forcible transfer of children as an act of genocide. The 1948 Convention on Genocide existed while residential schools were in play, existed here in Canada and on Turtle Island too. If we get more jurisprudence, information, that the forcible transfer of children from Ukraine to Russia is an act of genocide under the Genocide Convention. It'll give many of us advocates and Indigenous communities in particular the ability to describe in concrete legal terms under international criminal law that the forcible transfer of Indigenous children from their communities into residential schools wasn't just a human rights violation, wasn't just a mistake, wasn't a sordid chapter in history, but was an act of genocide, and Canada knew it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? As we acknowledge the end of the first year of the from the start of the Russian invasion, I will be providing a brief overview of the role of intelligence that intelligence agencies played in this conflict that's becoming increasingly visible. Since the start of the Russian invasion on February 24th last year, Western defense ministries and intelligence agencies around the world closely monitored and analyzed the situation in Ukraine and provided regular updates to Ukrainian government. In general, the Western intelligence community had played an important role in broader efforts to promote security and stability in the region, even during the war. So since the start of the war, and even prior to that, several activities were involved in intelligence gathering, or several types of intelligence gathering. And that includes signal intelligence, geospatial, open source intelligence, OSINT, that I'll address later, financial, human, social media, and cyber intelligence. So these intelligence assessments are shared with Ukraine, other countries in the region and globally, and international organizations through diplomatic channels, intelligence gathering agreements, public statements, and other means. Furthermore, intelligence organizations provide support to military and diplomatic efforts to address the conflict, and they deliver strategic and tactical intelligence to the Ukrainian government, such as identifying key targets and threats and coordinating this with intelligence agencies. So among the main producers of intelligence in this conflict are British Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon, CIA, Germany's Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, SBU, which is Ukrainian intelligence agency, and citizen journalists. Among the consumers of intelligence are policymakers, military leaders, international organizations such as International Criminal Court, whose picture here you have on the slide, and the media. And the latest example of the activity of International Criminal Court who is using such intelligence is the issuing of the arrest against Russian President Vladimir Putin that was already mentioned. During and for several months prior to the invasion, something truly historical and unprecedented happened when the United States government decided to declassify and release to the global media the data concerning the movement of Russian armed forces and their buildup in Belarus on the northern Ukrainian border. While policymakers across Europe, specifically in the European Union, and Russian liberal circles contemplated whether the act of open aggression was possible, the Americans were telling the world that it was not only possible, but very probable and even likely. Thus, they took a very active role in intelligence gathering and assessment and sharing, and their allies followed. So the allied intelligence activities happening in several dimensions, such as satellite imagery analysis, social media monitoring for evidence of Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns. To give you an example, even before the war started, already in 2015, British intelligence agencies uncovered a Russian fake news story that claimed that Ukrainian soldiers had crucified a 3-year-old boy. So that's an example of how manipulative the social media scenarios can be and how important the monitoring is. Other activities include financial intelligence, monitoring of Russian military movements, sharing of military intelligence. The collaboration between intelligence agencies is reciprocal. Ukrainian officials have shared intelligence with their Western allies about the use of Russian weapons system. And this is also quite unprecedented. This has been included into analysis of shooting down a Malaysian airline flight over Ukraine in 2014, which also brings us to the start of this story and the events that unfolded after the annexation of Crimea, the turbulent spring in Ukraine with change of government, and then the shooting down of the airliner. In addition to the allied intelligence efforts, a homegrown open source intelligence sprung up as a community of informal and amateur intelligence agents, and they're very important to the war efforts. A citizen who provides amateur intelligence information in wartime is often referred to as open source intelligence contributor or a citizen journalist. The difference between a citizen journalist and an eyewitness is that the latter can provide first-hand accounts of events, including details that might not be captured on cameras or other forms of recording equipment. And the former will share the data in an organized way with either an organization or a network or a government agency. And what are the characteristics of amateur intelligence agents? And by the way, the data, metadata that's been collected through the efforts of amateur intelligence agencies is feeding into the knowledge that professional intelligence agencies and different international organizations are taking and processing to build cases for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and even genocide. So the amateur intelligence agents are motivated to help their country. They typically have access to information that's not available to general public. They use technology. Many work collaboratively. They also take risks to collect and share information and may be subject to harassment, intimidation, or violence, and may use various methods to confirm the authenticity of their sources. And overall, this amateur intelligence community or contributors provide real-time information that can help supplement and enhance the work of professional intelligence agencies. Here are the examples of who is documenting the impact of war among these amateur intelligence agencies. And what I'd like to say before that is that it's very important to understand that the birth of all these organizations is driven largely by maturing of Ukrainian civil society, and I will address this a little bit later. So some examples include Euromaidan Press, which is Ukrainian newspaper published in English language, Inform Napalm, Ukrainian volunteer-run initiatives that investigate the Russian military intervention in Ukraine. Another publication is called The Interpreter. Something that was initiated by a private citizen is called Ukraine at War, which is a Twitter account, and Bellingcat that many may have heard about. It's a British investigative journalism agency that heavily relies on open source intelligence. So going back to the efforts of Ukrainian civil society, it has undergone tremendous change since Ukraine became an independent country in 1991. However, the strength of civil society is largely determined by political developments, social and economic challenges, and sometimes external factors. In the early 1900s, civil societies organizations rapidly expanded and focused on democracy, human rights, media, environmental protection, and other social issues. The civil society struggled between 1994 and 2005 under the presidency of Leonid Kuchma, where media was harassed and restrictions were put on freedoms. Then it rebounded again under the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko between 2005 and 2010. And the situation deteriorated again under Viktor Yanukovych, and this was already addressed, the revolution of dignity that once again resulted in a change of government. It's important to reflect on the evolution of Ukrainian civil society because again, all these measures contribute to people's willingness to sacrifice their well-being, their time, their safety and security for the common cause in the conditions of war. And other activities that these citizen activists are engaged in is live streaming and recording videos directly from the conflict zones. You may have seen those. in the media, sharing them on social platforms, taking pictures of equipment, weapons, even recording of audios of shelling, gunfire, and explosions, where the opposite side claims there have been none. So all this evidence allows to validate what's happening in the urban areas as well as the battlefields. Activists use GPS to track and map military movements, communicate with other citizens, use messaging apps, and report incidents. They also take pictures of propaganda posters and leaflets distributed by the Russian-backed forces. During the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, there have been several cases of destruction of heritage sites, and activists closely documented those. And on the slide, you have some examples of organizations who follow and document the destruction of world-renowned heritage sites. The Euromaidan Press, for instance, has documented the destruction of Donetsk Regional Museum of Local Ore, which housed a valuable collection of regional artifacts. Again, that started to be shelling in August 2014, bringing us back to the beginning of this story. The Ukrainian Institute of National Memory documents the destruction of monuments and memorials across Ukraine. Europa Nostra is another cultural organization involved in these activities. The International Council of Monuments and Sites have highlighted the destruction of historical city of Luhansk in the eastern region and the damage to the UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Kiev-Pечorsk Lavra Monastery complex. An example of investigative journalism includes such organizations as Bellingcat. And here on the left side of the slide, you see Hristo Groziev, the head of the Bellingcat, and has recently, he was forced to change his place of residence from Vienna, where he resigned for previous 20 years under the threat from Russian intelligence and security agencies due to the work that he does to contribute to peace. And Bellingcat does investigations not only in Ukraine, they get involved in investigative journalism and reporting around the world and in many global scenarios and conflicts. And this agency, for instance, helps identify Russian military units that have been involved in the fighting, down to actually personnel who has been involved and named, identified Russian propaganda outlets through the internet, and tracking the spread of false information on social media. And they also investigated alleged chemical weapons attacks previously in Syria and now in the eastern parts of Ukraine to help uncover evidence of war crimes and other abuses. Finally, there is satellite imagery that has been used in this conflict really widely. Several companies have provided satellite images in the media, most notably a company called Digital Globe. It's a US-based commercial vendor out of Colorado that provides high-resolution satellite imagery and geospatial information to governments, businesses, and nonprofits. It operates a massive constellation of high-resolution Earth observation satellites. And applications include not only times of crisis, but environmental monitoring, disaster response, military intelligence, and infrastructure planning. In 2019, Digital Globe was acquired by Maxar Technology, and that's probably the company that most of us are familiar with, and we see images produced by Maxar since the very beginning of the invasion, since that convoy of Russian trucks that was building its strengths along the Belarus-Ukraine border, and you see some image of that truck convoy. Sorry, that's the image of the bridge. I think it's in the last slide. That was delivered by Maxar. In conclusion, going forward, intelligence will continue to play an important role in this conflict, and especially human intelligence. And as it was already mentioned, in the estimate of Western intelligence agencies, the Russian side has already sustained an unprecedented number of casualties, up to 200,000. To give you a comparative point, during its entire involvement in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union between 1979 and 89 only lost 15,000 men. And so this is really a very big scale in 1 year. But the success of human intelligence will also depend on collaboration with the West, access to modern technology, failures of Russian intelligence, and continuation of democratic reforms in Ukraine. And specifically, the efforts of the Ukrainian counterintelligence community to unveil acts of treason and sabotage in favor of the Russian side, and those reforms and measures that are already taking place. And we hear from time to time that Zelensky himself issues detention or house arrest of so-and-so high officials in the security apparatus to investigate for possible leakage of information and any crimes committed. So I'm going to end at that, and we'll go to our Q&A next. Thank you.